Chapter 5, Colonial Society on the Eve of Revolution. So we're looking at what the colonies looked like in America from the years 1700 to 1775, right before the Revolutionary War begins and America declares its independence. So there's a lot of not that exciting facts in this chapter, but we need to understand what the colonies looked like. We see what their demographics look like with over 300, less than 300,000 people, exploding to the number of 2.5 million by the time we get to right before the revolution. You can also see the demographic breakdown with only having 20,000 blacks. And we see that the slave trade clearly increases over the 1700s to bring in 500,000 African Americans. There's also 400,000 white immigrants. So the colonies continue doubling in their population every 25 years, which tells you just how actively growing the colonies are. In 1775, the five largest colonies were Virginia, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Maryland, with the four largest cities being Philly, New York City, Boston, Charleston. 90% of colonists live in rural areas, which also would tell you that most of them will end up being farmers as far as their occupation. Most immigrants also look toward the frontier, so the story of America is not only growing, but also rapidly expanding west as the years pass. In the mingling of the races, we see that a large percentage of our population here in America is made up of Germans. Sure, that's just 6%, but they continue to grow. Most of them went toward Pennsylvania's backcountry. There are so many Germans that by the time our nation begins, it was actually close to voting that German would be our official language. So the Scots-Irish are a very influential group in our nation early on and even into the 1800s because even though they make up only 7% of our country, they are quite the cultural influence. So they come over from poverty in northern England, and when they get over to America, they hate authority and they hate how the English felt toward them and treated them. So they are the ones who push the western frontier. While they're out there, yes, they build flimsy cabins, but they're most known for their contentious nature, constantly picking fights with authority and Indians. When you think of a lot of the early fights between the authorities and the frontiersmen, it is often between groups that are Scots-Irish. Their individualistic nature also created conflict, including in 1764 when a group known as the Paxton Boys get into a fight with some Native Americans. The Native Americans actually run towards Philadelphia for safety, with the Paxton Boys, a little sauced up, if you will, chase them toward the city. Luckily, Benjamin Franklin was there to stop them and to calm them down and, well, tell them to sober up. So they go home, and luckily the situation calms down. But these Scots-Irish Paxton Boys continue to create issues across the frontier. Regulators are a similar group on the frontier of North Carolina, constantly fighting with the authorities there, and especially wanting to resist the power of the wealthy coastal elites. And you can look more on the outline on OneNote if you'd like to see more about them. And this is a breakdown demographically. Of course, most of them are English, and African Americans, by the time 1775 arrives, make up 19%. So again, seeing just what an impact the slave trade was having. And then you can see a general breakdown with the Scottish and German, and then Scots, Irish, Irish and Dutch, and other Europeans making up those numbers. So the colonies were quite diverse, as that chart just showed you, with 49 of the colonists being Anglo-Saxon and numerous other small groups as well. New England was the least diverse. That's probably because they were a very selective society where only Puritans and those who wanted to live in their type of religiously centered culture would go. The middle colonies were, from the very beginning, as we described in New York when it was taken from the Dutch, were quite diverse. So the middle colonies, especially Pennsylvania as well, continued to bring in the bulk of white immigrants, especially those who didn't want to be part of that religious society up north. The largest non-English group were Africans. The South had about 90% of these colonial slaves who developed their own culture. Native Americans were also there, but you see they're not really counted in the demographics, and quite frankly, that's very telling for what's happening in America during this time period and throughout our history. Native Americans are never really considered until the mid-1900s part of America. And so it's no surprise they're not considered part of the demographics there. So Native Americans were, those who wanted to live in our society were forced into praying towns and become Christianized and adopt English names. Near the Great Lakes, many Native American tribes were actually displaced and forced to join other new tribes. And we'll see over the years, those tribes will often join together and push against westward expansion unsuccessfully, but they will continue to resist. So what about Africans in America? Well, a lot of Africans lived across the South because that's where most of them were working as slaves. The Deep South had a lot worse slave life, and that's because the climate was hostile. and their labor was quite life draining. Literally, the mortality rate was much higher. That's because of the swampy rice plantations and the indigo plantations as well. Tobacco plantation work was actually easier, and because the plantations were closer, they had much more of a normal, well, not normal as it could be being slaves, but they actually had a social life between the plantations. The population growth came naturally. In other words, they did not have to bring more in to keep the population growing, although they did. And when female slaves become popular, it makes family life possible in the Chesapeake. Of course, later on in future chapters, we'll talk about the separation of those families. But regardless, early on, before the internal slave trade expands, selling slaves from across the states to the deep south, like Louisiana, we actually see some family life occurring. Slaves also developed their own cultures. In this next slide, we see them dancing. This is called the ring shout dance, where one person sings and the people on the left side of that painting dance in a circle, and it's kind of a call and response type singing. We also see them playing instruments. Instruments like the banjo were brought over by Africans and adopted into American culture. We also see many slaves become artisans. They would be carpenters, bricklayers, and tanners, and their skills were actually in demand across many plantations. Unfortunately, because of the slave revolts below, including the New York Slave Revolt and the Stono Rebellion, which we've already talked about, unfortunately for those workers, they would often, or eventually, they get banned from traveling from plantation to plantation because they began developing revolts and conspiracies to revolt. So unfortunately, as time passes, their lives become more and more restricted on the plantation because of those restrictions. One major theme of American society is and always has been social mobility, the ability of anyone in America to climb the ladder from one social class to another across their lifetime or across generations. Despite the fact that this was very popular in this time period, there is stratification or separate of those classes. This is because you have wars that create wealthy merchants and widows and orphans. So there will always be more than one class. So even though we do have a lot of ability to climb social classes, we still have those challenges separating the top and the bottom. New England also ran out of land, and families were forced to hire out their children as wage laborers in the burgeoning or growing manufacturing system. Slave owning planters also ruled the South. The lower class swells with continued arrival of indentured servants. So paupers who were part of that indentured servant class are people who would have owed debts back east, and they would come here, work an indenture to pay off their debt to whoever it was. And of course, convicts were useful workers because they would have just been rotting away in the prisons at home, but instead England allows them to come over here for a fresh start, work through a 7 to 10 year contract, and then they would earn their freedom. In society, we also have Christian ministers being highly regarded, and that's because of the overall religious beliefs that were across the colonies. Meanwhile, physicians and doctors and lawyers were disliked and distrusted. It's no surprise that lawyers are disliked and distrusted, but you may find it surprising that doctors would not be. And that has more to do with the fact that they were unskilled and unknowledgeable. Not that they weren't educated, but back then their understanding of medicine just wasn't very significant or well informed enough. Going back to the Salem witch trials, the reason why they broke out is because one doctor did not prescribe that it was a physical ailment that caused the girls to have seizures, but rather witchcraft. So that tells you just how informed and successful they were. This map shows the general economies of each little area, so you can look at that later if you would like. Workaday America, 90% of colonists worked in agriculture, which reflects that same number at the beginning that talked about the 90% being in rural areas. The middle colonies grew bread. That's why we call them the breadbasket colonies in your colonies activity. Maryland, Virginia focused on tobacco, whereas New England fished to feed its people. So the triangular trade route developed, helping the colonies profit. So this map shows not so much triangular trade, but the idea is that manufactured goods would come from Europe, be sold in Africa for slaves, and then they would make the trip to the Americas for raw materials, whether that be rice, whether that be lumber or tobacco. They would get those products and take them back to Europe and continue that cycle again. So triangular trade helped the colonies profit. We didn't have manufacturing, but we did have the raw materials that other nations wanted. And that continues throughout much of American history with the fact that our raw materials had not been used up by any nation before us, and it helps us become a popular site of trade. Regardless, lumbering and naval supplies were some of our most highly valued things. With Britain wanting to grow their navy to continue growing in power across the world and spreading to more colonies, the king would claim the largest trees. Colonists didn't always appreciate this because they couldn't make a profit on trees claimed by the king, but they were able to find enough trees to continue making money. So we've already talked about the Navigation Act, which went into mercantilism, and now we have the Molasses Act. Molasses Act stacks on top of that, saying that North America cannot trade, or British North American colonies can't trade with the French West Indies. This made a lot of colonists mad because just like the trees and just like the Navigation Acts, it would cut into their profits. So they respond by smuggling and bribing officials, revealing a will to resist control, and this foreshadows our spirit of resistance and rebellion leading into the revolution. As far as transportation, you can read through this if you'd like, but basically it was very hard to develop roads. There wasn't a lot of money raised for them, and we had only brand new roads being built. And so as we stretched our frontier rather swiftly, it's hard to keep up with good infrastructure. So taverns also spring up, and when we look at the revolutionary time period, we'll see men like Samuel Adams use taverns as a way to spread their news and gossip, and also play a part in creating a conspiracy and network to undermine the British government. Despite all these challenges, an intercolonial postal system was created by the mid-1700s. That is so exciting. What about religion in the colonies? As far as colonial religion and the government being involved in it, many churches were supported by people's taxes. So you have the congregational churches in New England, where each city had its own church that would be supported and funded by taxpayers there, whether or not they attended the church. And same thing for the Church of England and the southern colonies and in a couple of the middle colonies as well. So we see the churches propped up by tax money, which is one of the first reasons why we come up with the idea separation of church and state in the early 1800s. While 74% of the people living in America claimed church membership, the majority did not worship in any church. Unfortunately, they would be more focused on their works or their jobs or whatever made their money and paid their bills. So although America was founded with Christian principles, and they claimed Christianity as their primary religion, did not mean everybody was extremely involved in the worship services. Then you have two different churches, the primary churches in the area were the Church of England, which would be viewed as a prop of king's authority, the way that he exerted his power beyond politics and the political realm. He would also exert his authority through the church. This is considered a less fierce church, less passionate, I guess, and outreaching and mean toward those who weren't attending. It's also more worldly and probably most, what they preferred the most, the shorter sermons. In the Congregational Church, that grew out of the Puritan churches in New England. It challenged the king's authority because, they refused to accept the king as leader of the church, and that only the leaders in each individual church in each town would have authority. And so they supported those churches as well by taxing all residents in the cities where they resided. On the left is the main thing I want to focus on here. The right is the demographics of what different denominations existed in religions. But on the left, you see the years in which the church was disestablished as far as being tax supported. You see in Rhode Island, New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, a lot of states founded not with a particular religious purpose in mind. In Pennsylvania being religiously free for Quakers, in Rhode Island by Roger Williams, religiously free as well. You see them not having a church that's supported by taxes. Then you see in the southern colonies, because they all become royal colonies and are held by the king, they support the Anglican Church with their taxes. In New York, the Anglican Church as well. But also pay attention to the years that they stopped giving tax money to the Anglican Church. It's all around or right after the Revolutionary period. When you look at New England, the region founded purely for Puritan faith and their own religious freedom and the way to worship and how they saw fit, you see them not stopping the tax-supported church payment plan all the way into the 1800s, with Massachusetts being the last in 1833. So this brings us to, if 75% of people were worshipers but weren't attending, how did they feel about it? Well, religious fervor had died down over the 18th century due to the elaborate theology and membership compromises like the Halfway Covenant. They had given up on their earlier principles, and that frustrated some people. But beyond that, new ideas were sprouting, challenging their previous teachings and the long-established clergy or preachers. One belief system called Arminianism said predestination was not necessarily true and that all could be saved, not just the elect few that God had selected. So this allowed a lot of people to consider that they could not attend the churches and these demanding sermons, and they could be saved just by doing their own thing. The Great Awakening, however, explodes and reignites the passion of Americans' faith in Jesus because of speakers like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. Now, you'll read two excerpts in your activities. One of them will be Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, in which he strikes fear into his listeners as he describes an angry God ready to punish you and basically send you to hell at any moment. But you're just lucky. He's willing to love you enough to possibly forgive you and give you a chance for heaven. That was meant to scare people into behaving well. And the emotional approach and the emotions elicited by his sermons would bring people back to God. George Whitefield was similar, but he didn't use as much fear as emotional persuasion. His emotional sermons actually gets him exiled because he challenges the old way of preaching. He is kicked out of England, and when he comes to America, initially the clergy won't let him preach in the churches. So what he does is he travels around the colonies doing open air meetings, or if any buildings will let him preach in them, he would do it. And this attracts a massive audience. So already what you can see is George Whitefield traveling around the different colonies. That's him on the left. And yes, he is cross-eyed, but that's him preaching in the open field because many churches wouldn't let him in. On the right is a little pompous-looking Jonathan Edwards saying, "I'm going to scare you back to Jesus." So, the First Great Awakening, we have the old lights versus the new lights. The old lights were those who didn't like this new, sudden, emotional, and theatrical way of preaching. They preferred to get up in front of their audience like they'd been taught at their colleges and to read the Bible at them. And by golly, that was how they were supposed to learn to follow Jesus. The new lights, however, said that their emotional way of preaching brought people back. The revitalization in American religion brought about by their preaching styles is what was going to keep the church alive. And so you have this division between the old and new lights on how to do things. This causes splits amongst many denominations of Christians, including the Congregationalists and Presbyterians. And many other denominations like the Baptist and Methodist churches see massive growth throughout this time period. So what are the effects of this First Great Awakening? Well, first, emotional spirituality becomes normal. You no longer have to sit there and listen to long sermons being bored out of your mind. Instead, you get to feel inspired every Sunday. And this new theatrical way of preaching brings a lot of people back. New colleges are also founded because if you're not going to preach the way things had been done for years, then you need to train them in new ways of preaching. Also, there's a growing sense of, quote, Americanism. This is a movement and I guess you could say experience that all Americans felt. And it's unique to America. The First Great Awakening didn't occur back in Europe. So not only did every single colony experience this, but only the colonies experienced this, leading this to a true shared experience and American culture. And then finally, you have historians alleging that the willingness for people to challenge the old light religious authority meant that they would be more willing and able to challenge the king and parliament's authority going forward. So in some ways, people said that the First Great Awakening is responsible for the revolution. So education, schools and colleges had been reserved mostly for men, and not only just men, but primarily aristocratic men. Yes, New England and the Puritan education systems included everybody so that they become better Christians. But in areas like the South, only wealthy planters had education. In fact, the South does not have public school all the way until the 1870s. Schools in New England may have been lacking in consistent quality, but hey, at least they had them, and at least many of their children learned to read so that they could read the Bible. Colonial schools emphasized classical languages and biblical doctrine. May not surprise you, but as we've said earlier, the point of most education at this time was so people could be good Christians. And the reason why they had colleges was also so that they could become better preachers, with the only secular higher education school being the University of Pennsylvania. So once again, you see here, any school located in the New England colonies has a denomination of being congregational. And those in the middle colonies tend to be different as well. But I just wanted to show this because nearly every single major higher education school, which will later become our Ivy League schools, have a denomination attached to them. So clearly the purpose of school was to make them better preachers and Christians. What about actually developing American culture in this time period? What separated our culture from others? Well, most people would argue that we were borrowing from European styles, and no one in America was really super creative because we were derivative of what the Europeans had already done. So although we have John Trumbull and Charles Willson Peale as artists, they really don't do anything that stands out beyond just being what the Europeans had already done. Literature is a little bit different, with Phyllis Wheatley being an enslaved woman who is able to read and write and become famous for her writings. Then Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac. Most people think of it for predicting what the weather would do throughout the year for farmers to know how to harvest. But I remember it, and others do, because of the witty statements he had in there, like early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. So his creative and witty writings became quite popular. Also, science was slow to develop because we only had one first-ranked scientist in this entire time period, and that was Benjamin Franklin. Not only developing the key and the kite electricity, but also many other practical inventions that made him quite famous and respected, not only in America, but also in Europe. This is just a funny portrait of people having fun grabbing magnetic and static rods. What do we do today that people will look back 200 years from now and think, I can't believe they did that for fun? So one major event that does occur and one thing that makes America different from other countries is our freedom of the press. Where does this idea come from? So we had a few libraries, one of which was opened by Franklin for people to read from, and we did have newspapers. But the problem is that much of those newspapers did not have freedom to say what they wanted. So typically they were used to air grievances against other people and rally opposition to political opponents. But John Peter Zenger, a New York newspaper owner, he criticizes the corrupt governor in that state. When he does it, he is arrested and put on trial for his claims about the governor. Now, the way the law was written back then, libel could be charged on someone even if it was true. Basically, if you had disparaging remarks, it was still considered derogatory and thus could be prosecuted. So when he goes on trial, not only is he on trial, but also the freedom of the press in America is on trial. So his lawyer, Andrew Hamilton, no relationship to Alexander Hamilton, comes from Pennsylvania to help defend him. And the reason he does is he says that if Zenger is silenced in New York, then newspapers in Pennsylvania will be silenced, and soon all the colonies will be silenced. So he is able to convince the jury to basically, I guess, participate in bad law, because even though the law was written that Zenger would be guilty, they find him not guilty. And so by being found not guilty of libel here, this establishes the precedent of freedom of the press. And so from here on out, from Zenger onward all the way to today, we are able to allow our newspapers and writers to print true statements and can't be prosecuted because of it. Politics in the colonies. Every colony had some kind of control over them. 8 colonies had royal governors established by the king. 3 had proprietor-selected governors. And Connecticut and Rhode Island elected their own governors. Colonial legislatures reflected that of back home in England, with an upper house selected by the crown or proprietor and a lower house chosen by the people, basically a super wealthy class and then a lower class, potentially voted group. The big thing that all of them had in common was this ability to choose their own taxation rate through their own representation. They elected their officials, and those officials chose how much they would be taxed. So even though a governor could tell the legislatures what to do and could punish them or write laws over them, because the legislatures basically paid his salary, they often did what the legislators asked them to and tried their best not to make them angry. So you can see from the beginning that America developed their own politics and believed in self-taxation through representation. It's no surprise when England tries to change that in the 1760s and 70s that America chooses to declare independence, because it was not what they had become accustomed to. As far as developing democracy, southern colonies had county governments, town meetings in New England, and middle colonies had a mixture of the two. Ballot not given to everybody. We were not a very democratic country. In fact, the majority of whites could not vote, or white males. No women could vote, although New Jersey does give women the right to vote in the 1780s and 90s for a short time. They later rescind it. So you also had religious and property requirements to vote. So very few were able to vote, and strangely enough, only about half of those that had the right to vote, well, even less than that, exercised it. So colonies were not a true democracy, because you see how many people were limited in their ability to vote. But they're still far more democratic than European nations at this time, who were mostly ruled by monarchs. So after we look through all of this chapter, what really stands out is the colonies were very different. Each region had education or didn't have education, or reacted to things differently, or had some kind of different way of structuring their economy or structuring their political I guess, bodies, but all share a couple different things. They have independent economic development. Each person has the ability to choose what he does in life and how he makes his money. They have the ability to climb up and down those social classes through social mobility. And all of the colonies develop self-rule. Because we get so used to this self-rule and our own economic development, it's no surprise that in the 1760s and 70s, when Britain restricts these things, that we decide to declare our independence from them. So that does it for this chapter. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Watch the key questions video, and I hope that this helped. Have a great night.